Think about the last time you met someone you couldn't stop thinking about. Not because they were famous, not because they were the loudest person in the room, but because something about them felt different, rare. You walked away from that conversation, replaying it in your head, wondering what it was about them that made everyone else in the room feel a little more forgettable by comparison. Now, think about the opposite. Think about how many people you've met in your life who you can no longer remember at all. Coworkers, classmates, people you shared a meal with once, not because they did anything wrong, but because they didn't do anything at all. They were pleasant, they were fine, and fine is the fastest way to disappear. Here's the truth most people never learn. Being remembered has almost nothing to do with talent, luck, status, or beauty. It has everything to do with rarity. The people we never forget are the ones who refuse to be a copy of everyone else. They didn't try to be liked by all. They tried to be unmistakably themselves. And in doing so, they became impossible to forget. This is not a video about tricks. It's not about faking confidence or memorizing a few charismatic phrases to drop at parties. What you're about to hear is a complete framework built from psychology, history, and human behavior. For becoming someone whose presence leaves a mark long after they've left the room. Someone whose name comes up in conversations years later. Someone people measure other people against. Over the next 15 chapters, we're going to dismantle the false beliefs that keep most people invisible and rebuild piece by piece the qualities that make a person genuinely unforgettable. This isn't about becoming louder. It's about becoming realer. One more thing before we start. Rarity is not something you're granted by other people. It's not a title bestowed on you because you were clever enough or attractive enough or successful enough. Rarity is something you build deliberately through the accumulation of small honest choices made over and over in rooms where it would have been easier to disappear. Nobody is born unforgettable. People become unforgettable one undiluted moment at a time. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Myth of Being Liked. From the moment we're old enough to notice other people's opinions of us, we're taught a lie. We're taught that the goal is to be liked. Liked by our parents. Liked by our teachers, liked by our friends, liked by strangers on the internet who will never know our names. And so we spend decades of our lives quietly editing ourselves down, sanding off the edges, softening our opinions, agreeing more than we believe, laughing at things that aren't funny, staying quiet when we have something to say, all in service of this invisible scoreboard of likability. Here is the problem. Likability chased for its own sake is the single fastest path to becoming forgettable. Think about why. If your core strategy in every interaction is to avoid friction, to please, to blend into whatever the room wants you to be, then you are by definition erasing the very things that would have made you distinct. You cannot be memorable and universally agreeable at the same time. Those two goals are in direct conflict and most people never realize it because no one ever told them the truth. Being liked by everyone is functionally the same as being unremarkable to everyone. Consider how you actually experience other people. When you think back on the individuals who left the deepest impression on you, were they the ones who agreed with everything you said, who mirrored your opinions perfectly, who never pushed back, never surprised you, never said anything you didn't already believe? Almost certainly not. The people who stay with us are the ones who had an edge, a distinct point of view, a willingness to disagree, to hold a position even when it wasn't popular, to bring something into the room that wasn't already there. This doesn't mean you should go out of your way to be contrarian or difficult. That's just another performance, another mask. And people can smell performance from a mile away. What it means is that you have to release your grip on the outcome of being liked. You have to stop optimizing your personality for approval and start optimizing it for truth. When you speak, speak because you have something worth saying, not because you're trying to manage how someone feels about you afterward. There's a paradox hiding inside all of this. And it's one of the most important ideas in this entire video. The people who stop chasing likability are often the ones who end up the most liked and far more importantly the most respected. Because respect isn't handed out to people who are agreeable. Respect is handed to people who are real. Agreeableness might earn you short-term comfort, but realness earns you long-term gravity. It earns you the kind of presence that lingers. Think about the people in history, in business, in art who are remembered generations later. None of them got there by being universally liked in their own time. Many of them were controversial. Many of them were misunderstood, criticized, even mocked while they were alive. But they held their shape. They didn't dissolve into the expectations of the crowd around them. And because they held their shape, they became landmarks. People without a defined shape don't become landmarks. They become wallpaper. So, the first shift you have to make before anything else in this video will work is this. Stop asking, how do I get people to like me? And start asking, what do I actually think, feel, and stand for? And am I willing to let that be visible? That single shift in orientation is the foundation for everything that makes a person rare. There's another layer to this that deserves attention because it explains why so many people struggle to make this shift even after they intellectually understand it. The pursuit of likability is often rooted not in vanity but in fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. Somewhere along the way, most of us absorb the belief that disagreement equals danger. That if people don't approve of us, something essential about our safety in the world is at risk. This belief is usually formed early, often in childhood when approval from caregivers really was tied to survival and belonging. But it becomes a problem in adulthood when that same wiring gets applied to situations where the stakes are nowhere near as high. Disagreeing with a colleague in a meeting is not the same as being abandoned by a parent. Yet the nervous system often reacts as if it is. Understanding this doesn't mean you need years of therapy before you can start being more yourself. Although working through that fear consciously certainly helps. It means recognizing in the moment that the anxiety you feel before saying something honest is often an old alarm bell ringing for a threat that no longer exists. You can acknowledge the fear without obeying it. You can feel your heart rate rise slightly as you prepare to voice a real opinion and still choose to voice it anyway. That small act of choosing truth over comfort, repeated enough times, is what separates the people who eventually become rare from the people who spend a lifetime managing everyone else's perception of them. It's also worth naming the specific trap that catches so many otherwise capable people. The belief that being agreeable is the same as being kind. These are not the same thing. Kindness means genuinely caring about someone's well-being, even when that requires honesty they might not want to hear. Agreeableness means prioritizing the avoidance of discomfort, often at the expense of truth. A person who only ever tells you what you want to hear is not being kind to you. They are protecting themselves from the discomfort of your possible disapproval and calling it kindness. Real kindness sometimes sounds like disagreement, delivered with care. Real kindness sometimes means saying the harder thing because it's the truer thing. The people we remember as genuinely good in our lives were rarely the ones who agreed with everything. They were the ones who told us the truth when it mattered. Even when it wasn't easy to hear, and who did it because they respected us enough to be honest. Chapter 2. The Cost of Blending In. There is a quiet tragedy that plays out in almost every workplace, every friend group, every family gathering. And it goes almost entirely unnoticed because it doesn't look like a tragedy. It looks like politeness. It looks like professionalism. It looks like being a team player, but underneath it, something is being lost. And that something is the person's own signal. Blending in feels safe because it is safe. In the short term, if you never say anything too bold, never hold an opinion too tightly, never show too much of what actually excites or angers or moves you, you reduce your risk of rejection to nearly zero. Nobody can criticize a position you never took. Nobody can mock an idea you never voiced. Nobody can reject the real you if you never let the real you show up in the first place. This is the logic that keeps millions of talented, interesting, capable people trapped in permanent invisibility. But safety and memorability cannot coexist because memory is built on contrast. Your brain doesn't store away the ordinary. It doesn't waste energy remembering the person who said what everyone else said, dressed how everyone else dressed, laughed at the moments everyone else laughed at, and left no impression that couldn't have been left by literally anyone else in the room. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. And its entire evolutionary purpose is to notice what's different because difference is where the danger, the opportunity, and the meaning lies. If you give people nothing different to notice, you give their brains nothing to hold on to, and you vanish from memory almost as quickly as you appeared in the room. Here is the deeper cost. Though the one most people never calculate. Every time you blend in instead of standing as yourself, you are not just failing to be remembered by others. You are also training yourself to disconnect from your own instincts, your own preferences, your own voice. It becomes a habit. The muscle of self-expression atrophies from disuse. And one day, often years later, a person looks up and realizes they don't actually know what they think anymore because they spent so long mirroring the opinions of whoever was in front of them that their own internal compass went quiet. This is why the most forgettable people are often not untalented or unintelligent. Quite the opposite. Many of them are brilliant, insightful, capable of extraordinary things, but they've spent so long dimming themselves down to avoid discomfort that their brilliance never actually reaches the surface where other people can see it. Their light exists, but it's locked behind a door they've learned to keep shut. Breaking this pattern doesn't require a personality transplant. It requires small repeated acts of honesty. Saying the thing you actually think in a meeting instead of the safe version of it. Wearing the thing that actually reflects your taste instead of the thing that draws the least attention. Admitting you disagree instead of nodding along. Laughing at what's actually funny to you instead of what's socially expected. Each of these moments is tiny on its own, but stacked together over months and years. They rebuild the muscle of being visibly, unmistakably yourself. And that muscle once rebuilt is the single greatest asset you have in becoming someone people remember. The world does not reward the person who blends in. It rewards and remembers the person who was willing to be seen. There's a specific moment worth watching for in your own life because it tends to repeat itself over and over if you don't catch it. It's the moment right before you speak when you feel the pull between two versions of what you're about to say. One version is the honest one, slightly riskier, slightly more revealing of who you actually are. The other is the safer, smoother version, engineered to avoid raising eyebrows or inviting pushback. Almost everyone dozens of times a day chooses the second version without even realizing a choice was made. It happens so fast, so automatically that it feels less like a decision and more like a reflex. But it is a decision, and it is one of the most consequential decisions you make repeatedly across the course of your life because it is quietly determining whether you become a person others remember or a person others simply tolerate. Consider also what blending in does to your relationships over time, not just your reputation. When you consistently present a smoothed over version of yourself to the people closest to you, you rob them of the chance to actually know you. They form a relationship with the edited version, the safe version. And even if that relationship feels comfortable, it will always carry a subtle hollowness because it isn't built on the full truth of who you are. This is why so many people report feeling lonely even inside long friendships or long marriages. It isn't necessarily a lack of closeness in proximity. It's a lack of closeness in honesty. You cannot be deeply known by someone if you've spent years showing them a diluted version of yourself. And you cannot be unforgettable to someone who never actually got to meet the real you. There's a useful test you can run on your own life to see how much of this pattern has taken hold. Think about the last 10 conversations you had. In how many of them did you say something you didn't fully believe? Just to keep things smooth. In how many did you withhold an opinion, a preference, a piece of humor because you weren't sure how it would land? If the number is high, that's not a moral failing. It's simply a habit built over years, often for good survival reasons at the time. But habits can be examined, and once examined, they can be changed. The goal isn't to become reckless with your honesty overnight. It's to notice the pattern and to start choosing the truer version of your response just slightly more often than you did before. That small shift repeated across thousands of interactions over the course of a life is the entire difference between a person who blends into the background and a person whose presence becomes a landmark in the memory of everyone who encounters them. There's one more cost of blending in that rarely gets discussed, and it has to do with opportunity, not just memory. People extend opportunities, invitations, introductions, and second chances to those who left a distinct impression on them. If you've ever wondered why some people seem to have doors open for them that never seem to open for others of equal or greater talent, the answer often traces back to this exact dynamic. Decision makers, whether they're hiring managers, potential collaborators, or simply people deciding who to invite to the next gathering, are working from memory. And memory favors the distinct over the diluted. The person who blended in at the conference last year is not the person who gets the follow-up email 6 months later, even if their qualifications were just as strong. The person who said something real, something specific, something that lodged itself in someone else's memory, is the one whose name resurfaces when an opportunity appears. Blending in doesn't just cost you connection. Over the span of a life, it quietly costs you rooms you were never invited back into simply because no one remembered you were there. Chapter 3. The Power of Being Undiluted. If blending in is the disease, being undiluted is the cure. But this idea is often misunderstood. So let's be precise about what it actually means, because it is not what most people assume. Being undiluted does not mean being extreme, loud, or aggressive. It doesn't mean picking fights or manufacturing controversy for attention. Those are just different costumes worn over the same underlying insecurity, the same desperate need to be noticed rather than a genuine expression of self. Being undiluted means something much quieter and much more powerful. It means presenting yourself, your opinions, your tastes, your humor, your values without watering them down to make them more palatable to whoever happens to be in the room. Think of a strong espresso versus a cup of coffee that's been stretched with 3 extra cups of water. Both are technically coffee, but one has a flavor so distinct you remember it hours later, and the other disappears from your memory the moment the cup is empty. Most people, in an effort to be palatable to everyone, water themselves down until there is nothing left with any real flavor. They become drinkable by anyone, forgettable to everyone. The rarest people you'll ever meet have resisted this dilution. They've kept their opinions strong even when it would have been easier to soften them. They've kept their sense of humor intact even in rooms where it wasn't universally appreciated. They've stayed loyal to their particular taste in art, music, food, and ideas rather than constantly adjusting to mirror whoever they're speaking with. And because of this, meeting them feels like drinking something with an actual taste. You notice it, you remember it, you crave it again. There's a reason undiluted people tend to attract intensely loyal followings, whether that's in friendship, business, or any other domain. When you are fully yourself, unfiltered by the need to please everyone, you naturally repel the people who are never going to resonate with you anyway. And you draw in with tremendous force the people who do resonate with you. This is a far better outcome than being liked by everyone in a shallow, forgettable way. A smaller circle of people who deeply remember and deeply value you is worth infinitely more than a large crowd who barely register your existence. There's also a practical reason dilution fails as a long-term strategy. It's exhausting. Constantly adjusting your personality to match the room. Tracking what version of yourself you presented to which person. Remembering which opinions you're allowed to express around which people is cognitively and emotionally draining in a way most people don't even consciously register. It's a full-time job with no pay and no promotion. Undiluted people, by contrast, only have to remember one version of themselves because it's the only version that exists. That consistency isn't just memorable to others. It's restful for the person living it. Becoming undiluted starts with a simple but uncomfortable practice. Noticing every time you're about to soften an opinion, a joke, or a preference in order to make it safer, and asking yourself what would happen if you let it stand exactly as it is. Most of the time, you'll discover the fear was worse than the actual consequence. And each time you let your real self stand without dilution, you add a little more color, a little more flavor, a little more of the specific taste that makes you unforgettable. It's worth addressing a fear that often comes up at this point because it stops a lot of people before they even try. The worry that being undiluted will make you unlikable, difficult or hard to be around. This fear usually comes from confusing being undiluted with being inconsiderate. They are not the same thing. You can hold a strong, distinct opinion and still deliver it with warmth. You can have a specific, unapologetic sense of humor and still be generous and attentive to the people around you. Being undiluted is not about the intensity or aggressiveness with which you express yourself. It's about the honesty of it. A quiet person with clear, unwavering values can be just as undiluted as an outspoken one. Rarity isn't about volume. It's about integrity between what's on the inside and what's shown on the outside. There's also a slow compounding reward to staying undiluted that's easy to miss in the short term because the short term often feels harder, not easier. In the beginning, letting your real opinions and tastes show can feel exposing. You might get a few raised eyebrows. You might lose a bit of the effortless, frictionless approval you were used to, but over months and years, something remarkable happens. The people around you start to trust you more, not less, because they can feel that what they're getting is real. They stop wondering what you actually think behind the polite exterior because you've already shown them. That trust becomes the foundation of a different, deeper kind of connection than approval ever could have built. Approval is fragile and constantly needs to be re-earned. Trust once built on consistent honesty becomes remarkably durable. And it is trust, not approval, that people carry with them in their memory of you for years afterward. Think too about how undiluted people affect the rooms they walk into. Their presence tends to give others permission to be a little more honest themselves. When someone shows up fully as themselves, unapologetic about their particular tastes and opinions, it often has a ripple effect, loosening the artificial politeness that keeps a room stuck in shallow, forgettable interaction. This is one of the quiet gifts of rarity. It doesn't just make you memorable. It often makes the people around you a little braver, a little more willing to drop their own performance, if only for the length of that conversation. And those are the conversations and the people that everyone in the room ends up remembering long after they've gone their separate ways. Chapter 4. Presence is a choice. Most people believe presence is something you either have or you don't. Charisma, magnetism, the it factor, whatever you want to call it, is treated as a fixed trait, something you're born with or you're not. This belief is not only false, it's one of the most limiting beliefs a person can carry because it gives you permission to stop trying. If presence is genetic, why bother developing it? Presence is not a trait. Presence is a practice, and more specifically, it is a decision made moment to moment about where your attention goes. Watch closely the next time you're in a group setting and notice how many people in that room are only physically there. Their bodies occupy space, but their attention is scattered. Half checked out, thinking about their phone, rehearsing what they're going to say next, replaying something from earlier in the day. They are in the truest sense absent while present. And people feel that absence. Even if they can't articulate it, it registers as a kind of emotional static, a low hum of disconnection that makes the interaction forgettable, no matter how pleasant it was on the surface. Now, think about the rare individual who does the opposite. When you speak to them, their attention lands fully on you. They aren't glancing past your shoulder to see who else is in the room. They aren't formulating their next sentence while you're still finishing yours. They are for the duration of that conversation. Entirely there. This is an incredibly rare experience in modern life. So rare that when someone offers it to you even for 5 minutes, it feels almost startling. It feels like being seen in a way you rarely are. And that feeling is exactly why that person becomes unforgettable. Not because of what they said, but because of the quality of attention they gave you. This is the secret most people miss when they try to develop charisma. They focus entirely on what they're projecting outward. How they look, how they sound, how clever their words are. When the actual lever of presence is inward, it's the quality and direction of their attention. You do not need to be the most articulate person in the room to be the most memorable. You simply need to be the most present. Presence as a practice starts with small, deliberate choices. Putting your phone away fully, not just face down on the table, but out of sight and out of mind when you're speaking with someone. Making eye contact and holding it a beat longer than feels automatic. Letting a pause sit in a conversation instead of rushing to fill it with your own thoughts. Asking a follow-up question that shows you were actually listening to the specific words someone used, not just the general topic. None of these actions require talent. They require intention, and intention is available to anyone who chooses to exercise it. There's a compounding effect here that's worth understanding. Presence is contagious. When you give someone your full attention, it tends to draw their full attention back toward you, creating a kind of feedback loop of genuine engagement that neither person consciously notices, but both people deeply feel. This is why the most memorable conversations of your life probably didn't involve the most impressive facts or the funniest jokes. They involved a rare mutual quality of attention that made the exchange feel alive rather than performed. Presence is a choice you make in every single interaction, and it is available to you regardless of your natural personality, your social status, or how the day has gone so far. The next room you walk into is an opportunity to practice it. It helps to understand why presence has become so rare in the first place, because the answer explains why it has such an outsized impact when someone offers it. We live in an environment engineered quite deliberately to fracture attention. Every notification, every app, every scrolling feed is designed by people who understand exactly how to pull focus away from whatever is directly in front of us. Over years of exposure to this environment, most people's attention has been trained into a state of constant low-grade distraction. Even when their devices are nowhere in sight, the mind has simply learned to flick from one stimulus to the next, rarely settling fully on any one thing, including the person standing right in front of them. Against this backdrop, a person who can offer sustained, undivided attention isn't just being polite. They are offering something that has become genuinely scarce, something most people no longer even expect to receive. And scarcity, as we'll explore later in this video, is one of the deepest drivers of how memorable something becomes. Presence also has a physical dimension that's easy to overlook. The body communicates attention long before words do. Someone who is truly present tends to orient their body toward the person they're speaking with rather than angling away toward the door or the rest of the room. Their posture tends to be open rather than guarded. Their movements slow down slightly rather than fidgeting or checking the time. None of this needs to be performed or faked, because faking it rarely works. People can sense the difference between genuine attention and its imitation almost instinctively. But when the internal choice to be present is real, the body naturally follows, and the signals it sends reinforce on a level beneath conscious awareness. The sense that this interaction matters. There's a final layer to presence worth naming, because it's often the hardest one to practice. Being present with discomfort, not just with pleasant conversation. It's relatively easy to be attentive when a conversation is fun, light, or flattering. It's much harder to stay fully present when someone is expressing something painful, disagreeing with you, or bringing up a topic that makes you uncomfortable. The instinct in those moments is often to mentally check out, to start planning your response or your exit rather than staying with what's actually being said. But it is precisely in those harder moments that presence leaves the deepest impression. The person who can stay grounded, attentive, and unhurried even in an uncomfortable exchange demonstrates a kind of emotional steadiness that people remember for years. They become the person others think of when they need someone who can actually handle the hard conversation, not just the easy one. That reputation, once earned, is one of the rarest and most valuable forms of memorability there is. It's worth closing this chapter with a simple practical reframe you can carry into your very next conversation. Instead of walking into a room thinking about how you're going to come across, what impression you're going to make, how interesting or funny or impressive you're going to seem, try walking in with a single different question in mind. Who is in front of me? And can I give them my full attention for as long as we're together? This reframe does two things at once. It takes the pressure off you to perform because your job is no longer to be impressive. It's simply to be attentive. And it almost always results in you being remembered far more favorably than any amount of calculated charm could have achieved, because people don't actually remember how impressive you were nearly as vividly as they remember how it felt to be around you. Presence more than any single word or achievement is what determines that feeling. And that feeling is what people carry with them long after the specific details of the conversation have faded. Chapter 5. The Weight of Your Words. Most people speak far more than they need to, and in doing so, they dilute the value of everything they say. This chapter is about a principle that sounds counterintuitive at first: the less unnecessary noise you produce, the more weight your actual words will carry and the more deeply people will remember what you say. Think about the people you know who talk constantly, filling every silence, narrating every thought as it occurs to them, adding commentary to everything happening around them. Now think about how much of what they say you actually remember a day later. Almost none of it, because when everything is spoken, nothing is emphasized. The brain once again is built to notice contrast. And a person who speaks constantly offers no contrast between their meaningful statements and their filler. Everything blends into an undifferentiated stream that the mind quickly learns to tune out. The same way you stop noticing a fan running in the background of a room. Now think about the person who speaks rarely but meaningfully when they do choose to say something. People lean in because experience has taught them that this person doesn't waste words. Their silence, far from being a weakness, becomes a kind of setup, a moment of anticipation that makes whatever comes next land with far more force. This is not a trick or a manipulation. It's simply an honest reflection of how much thought and intention went into the words before they were spoken. This principle shows up across history in the way we remember great leaders, thinkers, and communicators. It is rarely the person who talked the most in the room who is remembered for what they said. It is almost always the person whose words were chosen with care, spoken with intention, and left with room to breathe. A single sentence delivered with full presence and genuine conviction will outlast an hour of scattered chatter in the memory of everyone who heard it. Developing this quality requires you to fight against a very natural human impulse: the discomfort of silence. Silence in a conversation can feel awkward, and the instinct to fill it with words, any words, is powerful. But every time you resist that instinct, every time you let a pause exist without rushing to fix it, you are training yourself toward a kind of communication that carries far more weight. You are learning to speak because you have something to say, not because silence made you uncomfortable. This doesn't mean becoming withholding or cold or refusing to engage in casual, light-hearted conversation. That would just be another kind of performance, another mask. What it means is developing a habit of checking in the moment before you speak. Whether what you're about to say is adding something real, whether it's an honest reaction, a genuine question, a piece of insight, or whether it's simply noise generated to avoid the discomfort of quiet. Over time, this habit reshapes not just how others experience you, but how you experience yourself. You start to trust your own words more because you know they weren't thrown out carelessly, and other people learn to trust them too, which is precisely why they remember them. The weight of your words is not determined by your vocabulary or your eloquence. It is determined by your restraint. The person who says less but means every word of it becomes the person whose voice echoes in someone's memory long after the conversation has ended. There's a related skill worth developing alongside restraint, and that's precision. It's not enough to simply talk less. The words that do come out need to actually say what you mean rather than circling around it with vague hedged language. Notice how often people bury their real point under a pile of qualifiers. I sort of feel like maybe this could just be me, but I don't know. It's probably nothing. But each of these hedges softens the impact of what follows. And when a person hedges constantly, their listener learns over time to discount everything they say by roughly the same margin. Precision means trusting your own perception enough to state it plainly, not aggressively, not without humility when appropriate, but plainly. I think this is a mistake. This mattered to me. I disagree. These short, direct statements carry far more weight than their hedged equivalents, and they are far more likely to be remembered accurately because there's no ambiguity left for the listener's memory to smooth over or forget. It's also worth understanding the role that timing plays in the weight of your words. The same sentence spoken at the right moment can change the entire trajectory of a relationship or a conversation. Spoken at the wrong moment, it can be completely lost or worse, misunderstood. Developing a sense for timing means paying attention not just to what you want to say, but to whether the room and the person in front of you are actually in a state to receive it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with an important thought is hold it for a few minutes or even a few days until the right opening appears. This is not the same as avoidance or cowardice. It's discernment. A truth delivered with good timing lands as insight. The same truth delivered carelessly at the wrong moment can land as an attack, even if that was never the intention. Finally, consider the words you choose to close a conversation with because endings tend to carry disproportionate weight in memory. Psychologists have long understood that people remember the peak and the ending of an experience far more vividly than the middle of it. This means the last thing you say to someone, the note you leave a conversation on, often becomes the dominant impression they carry away, regardless of how the rest of the exchange went. A conversation that meanders through forgettable small talk, but ends with one genuine, specific, well-chosen sentence. A real compliment, an honest question, an unexpected piece of insight will often be remembered far more fondly than a conversation that was engaging throughout, but fizzled out on a flat, forgettable note. Paying attention to how you close an interaction, not just how you fill it, is one of the most underused tools in becoming the kind of person whose words people carry with them long after the conversation has ended. Chapter 6. Emotional Fingerprints. Every person leaves behind an emotional residue after an interaction. A feeling that lingers in the other person long after the specific words have faded. This residue is what psychologists sometimes call an emotional fingerprint, and it is without question the single most powerful driver of whether someone remembers you fondly, remembers you with discomfort, or forgets you altogether. Most people obsess over what they said in a conversation, replaying their own sentences, wondering if they sounded smart or funny or impressive. But the person on the other end of that conversation rarely remembers the exact words. What they remember is how the exchange made them feel. This is one of the most consistently underestimated truths about human memory. Ask yourself honestly how many exact conversations you can recall word for word from even a week ago. Almost none. Now ask yourself how many feelings from those same conversations you can still access. Far more. The feeling of being talked down to in a meeting. The feeling of being truly heard by a friend during a hard week. The feeling of being made to laugh so hard your stomach hurt. These feelings survive in memory long after the specific dialogue has dissolved because emotion is processed and stored differently than fact. It's stickier. It resists forgetting in a way that plain information simply doesn't. This means that if you want to become unforgettable, your primary focus should not be on sounding impressive, being the most articulate person in the room, or delivering the cleverest line. Your primary focus should be on the emotional residue you're leaving behind in every interaction. Are you leaving people feeling smaller, more anxious, more defensive than they were before they spoke with you? Or are you leaving them feeling a little more seen, a little more energized, a little more like themselves than they were a few minutes earlier? That residue repeated across every interaction you have becomes your reputation long before any specific accomplishment does. It's worth being precise about what creates a positive emotional fingerprint because it's not the same as simply being cheerful or complimentary all the time. In fact, Forced positivity, the kind that ignores real problems or glosses over genuine tension, often leaves people feeling slightly hollow rather than uplifted because they can sense the performance underneath it. A genuine positive fingerprint comes from something deeper. Making someone feel that their presence mattered to you, that you were glad they were there, that something about the exchange was real rather than transactional. You can deliver hard truths, disagree, even challenge someone, and still leave a positive emotional fingerprint as long as the underlying current of the interaction communicated respect and genuine care rather than dismissal or indifference. The opposite is also true and worth understanding because negative emotional fingerprints are remembered with even more intensity and permanence than positive ones. This is a well-documented feature of human memory. Often called negativity bias, we tend to hold on to painful or humiliating experiences with far more vividness than pleasant ones. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, remembering threats mattered more for survival than remembering pleasures. This means that a single moment of genuine dismissiveness, condescension, or cruelty can outweigh months of pleasant, forgettable interactions in someone's memory of you. One sharp, careless comment can undo years of goodwill. This isn't meant to make you fearful or overly cautious in every interaction. It's meant to highlight just how much weight your emotional impact carries, far more than most people realize in the moment they're creating it. Building consistently positive emotional fingerprints is a discipline, not a personality trait. And it starts with a habit worth adopting immediately. Before you walk away from any interaction, briefly ask yourself what feeling you likely left the other person with. Not what you said, not how you performed, but what residue you left behind. Over time, this small habit trains you to become far more attuned to your emotional impact in real time, which allows you to adjust before the interaction ends rather than reflecting on it with regret afterward. This single habit practiced consistently will do more to make you unforgettable than almost any other technique in this video because it addresses the layer of human memory that actually determines who we carry with us and who we let go. There's a further nuance worth exploring here because emotional fingerprints aren't only shaped by what you say. They're shaped just as powerfully by how you respond to the other person's emotions. When someone shares something difficult with you and you respond with genuine attentiveness rather than rushing to fix, minimize or redirect the conversation back to yourself, you leave behind a fingerprint of safety. That person learns on some level below conscious awareness that their emotions are welcome in your presence. That they don't have to perform composure or brightness around you. This is an extraordinarily rare gift in a world where most people often unintentionally respond to another person's pain with subtle discomfort, quick reassurance, or a change of subject. All of which communicate, however gently, that the emotion was too much to sit with. Learning to simply stay, to let someone's sadness or frustration or fear exist in the room without rushing to resolve it, is one of the most powerful ways to leave an emotional fingerprint that lasts. It's also worth considering how emotional fingerprints accumulate over the span of a relationship, not just within a single conversation. Every interaction adds a small deposit to an ongoing emotional account, one that either builds toward trust and warmth or erodes toward weariness and distance. This means that even a single relationship sustained over years has its own composite fingerprint formed by the sum of every exchange within it. This is why some relationships, even ones without any single dramatic moment, come to feel deeply significant, almost sacred. While others filled with pleasant but forgettable exchanges never accumulate any real emotional weight at all. If you want to be remembered fondly by the people closest to you, it isn't enough to occasionally deliver a grand gesture. The far more powerful strategy is to consistently deposit small genuine moments of emotional attunement into that account. Interaction after interaction until the accumulated weight of those deposits becomes something the other person can feel even when they can't point to any single moment that created it. One last distinction is worth making before we move on, because it separates genuine emotional impact from its manipulative imitation. Some people learn, whether consciously or not, to engineer emotional highs in others as a tool for being remembered, showering people with intense flattery, dramatic declarations of connection, or manufactured excitement designed to create a memorable peak in the interaction. This can work in the short term, but it tends to collapse under its own weight over time because manufactured intensity is exhausting to sustain. And more importantly, it's usually detectable at some level, even if the other person can't articulate exactly why the interaction felt slightly performed. Genuine emotional fingerprints come from actually caring about the impact you're having, not from strategically producing a particular reaction. This is why the practice suggested earlier in this chapter, simply asking yourself what feeling you likely left someone with, works so much better as a tool for real connection than any script or technique ever could. It orients you toward genuine attentiveness rather than performance. And that orientation, more than any specific words or gestures, is what people actually sense and remember. Chapter 7. The Discipline of Consistency. There is a seductive myth in our culture about memorability. And it goes something like this. To be unforgettable, you need one spectacular moment, one grand gesture, one viral instant of brilliance that burns your name into everyone's memory forever. This myth is appealing because it suggests memorability can be achieved quickly in a single dramatic act. It is also almost entirely false in believing it keeps people chasing the wrong strategy for years. The truth is that lasting memorability is built far more often through consistency than through singular spectacle. Think about the people in your own life who you consider truly unforgettable. The ones whose presence has stayed with you for years. In most cases, it wasn't one dramatic moment that earned that place in your memory. It was the accumulation of many smaller moments repeated over time that built a coherent, trustworthy, recognizable pattern. The friend who has shown up the same way with the same warmth and honesty across a decade of ups and downs. The mentor whose advice was consistently sound meeting after meeting, year after year. The family member whose word you never had to double-check because it had proven reliable every single time. Consistency, not spectacle, is what turns a pleasant impression into a permanent one. This matters because consistency does something that a single dramatic moment cannot. It builds predictability, and predictability builds trust, and trust is what allows a person to occupy real estate in someone else's long-term memory rather than just their short-term impression. A spectacular but inconsistent person might generate a burst of excitement or admiration in the moment. But if that same person is unreliable, if their warmth in one interaction is followed by coldness in the next, if their generosity one week is followed by self-interest, the next people learn, often subconsciously, not to fully trust or invest in remembering them. The nervous system in a sense protects itself from investing emotional weight in something unpredictable. But when a person's character holds steady interaction after interaction, something remarkable happens. The people around them stop bracing for inconsistency and start allowing that person to occupy a settled permanent place in their sense of who matters in their life. This is why consistency, though it sounds unglamorous compared to charisma or spectacle, is actually one of the rarest and most valuable traits a person can cultivate. Charisma is common in short bursts. Almost anyone can be charming for an hour at a party. Far fewer people can sustain the same core character, the same values, the same way of treating others across years of varying moods, stress levels, successes, and setbacks. It is this sustained sameness of character, not the intensity of any single moment, that ultimately earns someone a permanent place in the memory and respect of the people around them. There's a practical dimension to building this kind of consistency, and it starts with identifying the handful of values or behaviors you want to be reliably known for and then protecting them fiercely even when it's inconvenient. If you want to be known as someone who always tells the truth, that commitment has to hold even in the moments when a small lie would be easier. If you want to be known as someone who shows up for people, that commitment has to hold even on the days you don't feel like it. Consistency isn't tested in the easy moments. It's tested precisely in the moments when maintaining it costs you something. And it's exactly those tested moments that other people remember most clearly, because they reveal whether your character is something you perform selectively or something you actually live by. There's also a compounding quality to consistency that makes it uniquely powerful over the long run. A single act of integrity might go unnoticed, but the 100th act of integrity following 99 others just like it becomes undeniable. It becomes in the mind of everyone who has witnessed it simply who you are. And who you are once firmly established in someone else's mind is exceptionally difficult to forget because it stops being an impression and becomes an identity, one that people reference, rely on, and remember for the rest of their lives. There's an important distinction to draw here between consistency and rigidity because the two are often confused. And confusing them can lead people to build a kind of stubbornness rather than genuine reliability. Consistency of character does not mean refusing to grow, refusing to change your mind or repeating the exact same behaviors regardless of new information or circumstances. A person can update their opinions, develop new skills, and evolve significantly over the years while still being remembered as deeply consistent. As long as the underlying values driving those changes remain steady, what people actually track when they judge someone as consistent or inconsistent is not whether the surface details of that person's life stayed the same. It's whether their core character, the honesty, the care, the reliability underneath the specific decisions held firm even as circumstances shifted. Growth and consistency are not opposites. In fact, the ability to grow while remaining recognizably yourself rather than becoming an entirely different unrecognizable person with each new phase of life is itself one of the clearest markers of a strong, stable identity. And it's precisely this kind of person that others find easiest to trust and hardest to forget. There's also a quieter form of consistency worth naming, one that doesn't announce itself the way grand gestures do, but that accumulates enormous weight over time. Consistency in the small, unglamorous moments nobody is specifically watching for, showing up on time, even when it would be easy to be a few minutes late, and no one would likely comment on it. Following through on a small promise, even one so minor the other person might have forgotten they'd asked. Treating a stranger, a service worker, a person who has no power to affect your life in any way with the exact same respect you'd show someone influential. These moments rarely get noticed in the instant they happen, but people are watching more than most of us realize. And these unglamorous, unwitnessed consistencies are often what quietly separate the people we come to trust completely from the people we merely tolerate. It is precisely because no reward is attached to these small moments that they reveal character most clearly, and it is precisely because they reveal character so clearly that they become over time one of the deepest sources of a person's memorability. Chapter 8. Vulnerability as Strength. Of all the ideas in this video, this one is perhaps the most counterintuitive because it directly contradicts what most of us were taught about how to be respected and remembered. We were taught in ways both subtle and explicit, that strength means never showing weakness, that admitting doubt or fear or failure diminishes us in the eyes of others. And so most people spend enormous energy constructing a facade of constant competence, hiding their struggles, presenting only their polished, put-together side to the world. This strategy might earn a certain kind of surface-level respect, but it almost never earns deep lasting memorability because facades by their very nature are forgettable. There is nothing to hold on to in a facade. It's smooth, uniform, and interchangeable with every other facade constructed for the same defensive purpose. Vulnerability properly understood is not weakness. It is the willingness to let another person see something real and unguarded about you at the risk of their judgment. And this willingness, far from making you less respected, is one of the most powerful tools for making you unforgettable because it does something a polished facade never can. It invites genuine connection. When someone shares a real struggle, a real doubt, a real moment of failure, it gives the listener permission to stop performing their own facade in return. It signals on a deep level that this interaction is a safe space for honesty. And honesty is precisely what people remember because it's rare and because it makes them feel less alone in their own imperfections. Consider the difference between two versions of the same conversation. In one version, someone describes their recent success in glowing, effortless terms, presenting the achievement as though it came easily and without doubt. In the other version, someone describes the same success, but also mentions the specific moment they almost gave up, the fear they carried through most of the process, the mistake that nearly derailed everything. Which version do you actually remember more vividly? And which person do you feel more connected to afterward? Almost universally, it's the second version because the honest account includes the texture of real human experience. The parts that make the story specific and believable rather than generic and hollow. Polished stories are forgettable because they could belong to anyone. Vulnerable stories are memorable because they could only belong to the person telling them. This doesn't mean oversharing indiscriminately. Dumping every insecurity onto every person you meet, regardless of context or relationship. That's a different pattern entirely, one that often comes from a need for reassurance rather than genuine connection. And it can actually push people away rather than draw them closer. Skillful vulnerability is selective and intentional. It involves sharing something real at a moment when it's relevant with a person capable of receiving it well in a way that serves the connection rather than simply offloading your own discomfort. This distinction matters enormously. Vulnerability is a genuine act of trust deepens a relationship. Vulnerability is an unfiltered emotional dump disconnected from the context of the relationship can overwhelm it. There's a deeper reason vulnerability makes you unforgettable. One that goes beyond the immediate connection it creates. When you allow someone to see you struggle, doubt, or fail, and they witness you continuing forward anyway, you become a kind of proof to them, evidence that it's possible to be imperfect, and still worthy, still capable, still moving forward. This is an enormously valuable gift to give another person because almost everyone is quietly carrying their own hidden doubts and fears, wondering if they're the only one who feels that way. When you show them that you felt that way, too, and kept going, you don't just become memorable. You become a reference point they return to in their own private moments of struggle long after your conversation has ended. Few things earn a permanent place in someone's memory as reliably as having been even briefly a source of genuine reassurance during a moment they needed it. It's worth addressing directly why so many capable otherwise confident people struggle to practice this kind of vulnerability even when they intellectually understand its value. Often the resistance traces back to an old deeply held belief that vulnerability was punished at some point in the past. Perhaps in childhood, perhaps in an earlier relationship, perhaps in a professional environment that treated any admission of struggle as a liability. Once that belief takes root, the instinct to armor up, to present only the finished competent version of oneself becomes automatic, protective, and very difficult to override through willpower alone. If this describes your own experience, it's worth knowing that the instinct made sense given whatever taught it to you. The goal isn't to force yourself into vulnerability you're not ready for, especially with people who haven't earned that trust. It's to notice gradually the relationships in your life where vulnerability has actually been met with care rather than judgment. And to practice extending a little more honesty in exactly those spaces first. Vulnerability, like any skill, strengthens with practice, and it's far easier to build that strength in soil that has already proven safe than to attempt it everywhere at once. There's also a leadership dimension to vulnerability worth understanding because many people assume that positions of authority require the opposite, a constant display of certainty and control. In practice, the leaders people remember most fondly and follow most loyally are rarely the ones who projected flawless confidence in every situation. They're the ones who could say when it was true, "I don't have this figured out yet." Or, "I made the wrong call here, and here's what I'm doing about it." This kind of honesty from someone in a position of authority does something counterintuitive. Rather than undermining their credibility, it deepens it because it signals that their confidence when they do express it is earned and genuine rather than performed. A leader who never admits uncertainty teaches the people around them to distrust every claim of certainty that follows because they know the full picture is never being shown. A leader who can admit uncertainty when it's real earns something far more valuable. A reputation for trustworthiness that extends to everything else they say precisely because their audience has seen firsthand that they're willing to tell the truth even when it costs them some measure of polish. Chapter 9. The Art of Saying No. There is a particular kind of person almost everyone has encountered at some point. The person who says yes to everything, yes to every request, every favor, every invitation, every demand on their time and energy. On the surface, this seems like it should make someone well-liked, agreeable, easy to be around. But something curious happens to people who say yes to everything. Rather than becoming more valued, they gradually become less distinct, less respected, and ultimately less remembered. Their yes stops meaning anything because it was never filtered through genuine consideration. It became automatic, a reflex rather than a choice. And reflexes don't carry weight in anyone's memory. The ability to say no clearly, calmly, and without excessive apology is one of the most underrated tools for becoming a person others remember and respect. This is because a no delivered with genuine conviction rather than guilt or hostility communicates something powerful, that your yes when it comes is meaningful because it was actually chosen rather than defaulted into scarcity, as we've touched on earlier in this video and will explore more directly later as one of the fundamental drivers of perceived value. A person whose agreement, time, and attention are freely and automatically available to everyone essentially devalues those things through overabundance. A person who is thoughtful and selective about what they say yes to signals whether they intend or not. That their yes actually means something, and that signal alone makes every interaction with them feel more significant. There's also a deeper psychological reason that people who can say no become more memorable rather than less liked. Contrary to what most people fear, when someone consistently overrides their own preferences, boundaries, or capacity in order to accommodate every request made of them, it eventually erodes their own sense of identity. Because identity is partly built through the boundaries we hold, the things we protect, the lines we're willing to draw, even when it costs us social approval in the moment. A person without boundaries starts to feel to others strangely shapeless because there's nothing firm underneath their agreeableness for anyone to actually get to know. Boundaries paradoxically are what give a person definition. The same way a river bank gives a river its distinct shape rather than letting it dissolve formlessly across the landscape. Without boundaries, there's no shape left to remember. Learning to say no well is a skill. And like any skill, it can be developed deliberately. It starts with recognizing the discomfort that arises in the moment before you decline something. The fear of disappointing someone, of seeming difficult, of damaging the relationship. This discomfort is almost always worse in anticipation than an actual consequence. Most people, when told no with genuine respect and clarity, adjust far more easily than the anxious anticipation suggested they would. A simple honest no delivered without over-explaining or excessive apology tends to land far better than people expect. Over-explaining in particular is worth avoiding because it often signals guilt rather than confidence, and it invites the other person to negotiate against your boundary rather than simply accepting it. It's worth noting that the goal here isn't to become someone who says no reflexively or who takes pride in refusing things as a kind of performance of independence. That's just another mask, another version of managing how you're perceived. Rather than a genuine expression of considered choice, the goal is to develop the internal clarity to know what actually deserves your time, energy, and agreement, and the courage to decline what doesn't, even when declining carries some social cost. This clarity practiced consistently produces a person whose commitments carry weight, whose word means something, and whose presence in any project, relationship, or gathering is felt as a genuine choice rather than a foregone conclusion. That distinction, subtle as it might seem, is precisely what separates a person people forget from a person people remember. And remember, well, there's a particular fear worth addressing directly because it stops many people from ever developing this skill. The fear that saying no will cause the relationship to end, or that the other person will think less of them permanently. In practice, the relationships that dissolve the moment a reasonable boundary is introduced were rarely built on solid ground to begin with. They were often built on one person's continuous accommodation of the other. A dynamic that feels like closeness but is actually closer to quiet resentment waiting to surface. When a boundary ends a relationship, painful as that can be in the moment, it usually reveals something that needed to be seen rather than destroying something that was genuinely healthy. On the other hand, relationships that can absorb a clear, respectfully delivered no and continue on largely unaffected or even strengthened by the honesty are almost always the relationships worth investing more deeply in. Saying no in this sense doesn't just protect your time and energy. It functions as a kind of filter revealing which relationships in your life are built on mutual respect and which were only ever sustained by your constant self-eraser. It's also worth noting the particular power of a delayed yes. A practice that pairs naturally with the discipline of saying no rather than answering every request in the moment, whether with an automatic yes or an anxious over-explained no. There's enormous value in simply saying, "Let me think about it and get back to you." This small pause accomplishes several things at once. It removes the pressure to respond reflexively, giving you space to check the request against your actual capacity and priorities rather than against your fear of disappointing someone. It signals to the other person that your eventual answer, whichever way it goes, was genuinely considered rather than automatic. And it subtly reinforces the broader pattern this chapter has been building toward, that your time, attention, and agreement are not infinite default resources available to anyone who asks, but deliberate choices made with intention. Over time, this pattern becomes part of your reputation. And it is a deeply memorable one because so few people practice it. And because everyone who has received a thoughtful, considered response instead of a reflexive one can feel the difference immediately. It's worth closing this chapter by naming the emotional undercurrent that makes saying no so difficult for so many people in the first place, because understanding it makes the practice considerably easier. For many, an automatic yes is tied to a deep, often unconscious belief that their worth is contingent on their usefulness, that they are valuable to others only to the extent that they are accommodating, available, and helpful. If this belief is operating underneath the surface, then every no feels on some level like a small risk to one's fundamental worthiness of being kept around. Naming this belief directly often loosens its grip considerably, because once it's visible, it becomes easier to recognize as a distortion rather than a fact. Your worth to the people who genuinely value you was never actually contingent on your availability. It was contingent on who you are, how you treat people, what you stand for, and the quality of presence you bring when you do show up. A person who understands this at a felt level, not just an intellectual one, finds that saying no stops requiring the same reserve of courage it once did. It simply becomes another honest expression of a person who already knows their value isn't up for negotiation with every request that comes their way. Chapter 10. Becoming a living story. Human beings are at our core story processing creatures. We do not remember lists of facts nearly as well as we remember narratives. And this is not a coincidence or a cultural preference. It's a structural feature of how the human brain evolved to encode and retrieve information long before written language. Entire cultures preserved their history, their values, and their survival knowledge through stories passed from person to person. Precisely because narrative structure made information memorable in a way that plain facts never could. This ancient wiring is still fully active in every person you'll ever meet. Which means that if you want to become genuinely unforgettable, you need to understand how to become a story, not just a set of impressive facts about yourself. Most people, when trying to make themselves memorable, default to listing achievements, where they went to school, what they've accomplished, what titles they hold. These facts might earn a moment of respect, but they rarely earn a lasting place in someone's memory because facts alone don't have narrative shape. There's no tension, no turning point, no transformation for the listener's brain to hold on to and retell later. A story, by contrast, has all of these things, which is why a well-told story about a failure, a turning point, or an unexpected realization will almost always be remembered longer and shared further than a simple recitation of accomplishments. Becoming a living story doesn't mean fabricating a more dramatic version of your life than actually exists. It means learning to recognize and articulate the narrative threads that are already present in your actual experience. The moments of struggle, decision, growth, and change that give your life genuine shape, and becoming willing to share them rather than defaulting to the flattened achievement-only version most people present by habit. Everyone's life contains real narrative material. Most people simply never learn to notice it or offer it to others because they've been trained to present a resume instead of a story. There's a specific quality that makes a personal story land as memorable rather than self-indulgent. And it's worth naming clearly. The story has to serve the listener, not just the teller. A story shared purely to impress, to make the teller look good, tends to fall flat because the listener can sense that its purpose is self-promotion rather than connection. A story shared because it illuminates something true, something the listener might recognize in their own life, or because it offers a piece of hard-won insight, tends to land completely differently. The measure of a good story isn't how impressive the storyteller comes across. It's whether the listener walks away having gained something, a new way of seeing a problem, a moment of recognition, a piece of wisdom they didn't have before the story began. Becoming a living story also means paying attention to how you talk about your own life across many different conversations, not just in a single dramatic telling. The people who become truly unforgettable often aren't the ones who deliver one perfect story once. They're the ones whose ongoing life, told in fragments across many interactions over months and years, forms a coherent, evolving narrative that people find themselves wanting to keep up with. This is why some people's lives feel to the people around them like an ongoing story worth following, while other people's lives feel like a sequence of disconnected, forgettable updates. The difference usually isn't the raw material of the life itself. It's whether the person has learned to notice and share the through line running through it, the questions they're wrestling with, the changes they're moving through, the specific texture of what they're learning as they go. A person who shares their life this way doesn't just become memorable in a single moment. They become someone whose next chapter people find themselves genuinely curious about, which is in the truest sense what it means to become unforgettable over the long arc of a relationship rather than in any single conversation. There's a final piece worth adding here because it ties directly back to everything covered so far in this video. A living story only works if it's true. Every principle explored up to this point, resisting the pull toward likability, refusing to dilute yourself, offering real presence, speaking with weight, leaving honest emotional fingerprints, staying consistent, allowing genuine vulnerability, and holding real boundaries. All of it feeds directly into the raw material of the story you're actually living. A person who practices these principles doesn't need to manufacture a compelling narrative because their life naturally generates one full of real turning points, real growth, real texture, simply as a byproduct of living with this much honesty and intention. The people who struggle to find a story worth telling are almost always the people who have spent years avoiding the very things that create stories in the first place. Risk, honesty, discomfort, and change. Becoming a living story in the end is not a separate skill to learn on top of everything else in this video. It's the natural result of everything else in this video, practiced consistently enough that a real, distinct, memorable life simply emerges from it. These 5 chapters have moved us from the internal architecture of memorability, the feelings you leave behind, the reliability of your character, the courage to be seen honestly, the discernment to protect your time, into the outward expression of all of it. A life that reads to everyone watching is a story worth following. What remains is the final third of this framework, where we'll explore how rarity scales beyond individual interactions into something that outlasts you entirely. Chapter 11. The Currency of Attention. We live in an era where attention has become the single most valuable resource on Earth. More valuable in many ways than money itself. Because money can be earned back, but attention once spent is gone forever. Every platform, every product, every piece of content competing for a slice of your day understands this. And they are all in their own way fighting over the same finite resource, the number of waking hours you have to give. Understanding this shift is essential to understanding why rarity has become more powerful than ever before. Because in a world of infinite content and infinite noise, the person who can actually hold someone's attention genuinely and for its own sake has access to something almost nobody else does. Think about how differently attention functioned even a few decades ago. People had far fewer options competing for their focus, which meant almost anyone with a reasonable amount of charisma could hold a room. That is no longer true. Today, everyone you speak to is carrying in their pocket an infinite stream of alternative stimulation, perfectly engineered to be more immediately gratifying than most ordinary human interaction. This means the bar for actually holding someone's attention has risen dramatically. And most people, most conversations, most pieces of content simply cannot clear it. But this also means that when someone does clear that bar, when they manage to genuinely capture and hold another person's focus without gimmicks, that experience becomes disproportionately memorable precisely because it has become so rare. This is why the principles covered throughout this video, presence, restraint, honesty, vulnerability, are not just abstract virtues. They are in the most literal sense attention currency. Every one of them makes you the kind of person whose words and presence people actually want to give their limited precious attention to, rather than the kind of person whose presence people quietly tolerate while their mind wanders toward their phone. Attention, once it becomes genuinely engaged rather than passively endured, is what allows memory to form in the first place. You cannot be remembered by someone whose attention you never actually held. No matter how impressive your resume or how polished your appearance, there's an important nuance here worth naming clearly. Because the word attention can be misunderstood as simply meaning entertainment or stimulation. Holding someone's attention does not require being the most exciting, dramatic, or high-energy presence in the room. In fact, some of the most attention-holding people are remarkably calm, unhurried, even quiet. What actually holds attention is relevance and authenticity. The sense that what's being said or shown genuinely matters, that it isn't filler, that it reflects something true rather than performed. A quiet, genuine sentence delivered by someone who has clearly thought carefully about what they're saying, will often hold attention far more powerfully than a loud, energetic monologue with nothing real underneath it. Because the human mind, even in a world saturated with stimulation, still recognizes and gravitates towards substance the moment it appears. Understanding attention as a currency also changes how you should think about your own attention, not just how you capture other people's. The same scarcity principle that makes your engaged, undivided attention valuable to give to others also means you should be far more selective about where you spend it. Constantly consuming, constantly scrolling, constantly splitting your focus across a dozen open loops trains your own mind toward the same shallow, scattered state you're trying to avoid, triggering in others. A person who has cultivated the discipline to sustain deep singular focus, whether on a piece of work, a conversation, or a creative pursuit, tends to develop a different quality of presence than someone whose attention has been trained by years of fragmented consumption. That deeper quality of focus becomes part of what makes them memorable in the first place. Attention, in other words, is not just something you offer to others. It's something you build in yourself, and the strength of your own attention becomes over time one of your most valuable and rarest assets. There's one more dimension of attention worth considering because it directly shapes how memorable your presence becomes over repeated encounters rather than just a single meeting. People notice often unconsciously whether your attention toward them grows or shrinks the more time you spend together. Some people give their most focused, engaged attention early in a relationship when they're still trying to make an impression, and then let that attention quietly fade once the relationship feels secure. Others do the opposite. They treat familiarity as an invitation to deepen their attention rather than relax it. Staying genuinely curious about a person even after years of knowing them. It is almost always the second kind of person who becomes truly unforgettable over the long run because they've proven that their attention was never a strategy for winning someone over. It was and remains a genuine expression of ongoing interest in who that person actually is. There's a final practical implication worth drawing out of this chapter because it connects attention directly to the earlier discussion of presence. If attention is genuinely the currency that makes memory possible, then every distraction you allow into an interaction is in effect a small withdrawal from that currency. A signal, however unintentional, that something else has claimed priority over the person in front of you. This is worth taking seriously, not as a moral failing, but as a practical understanding of how memory actually forms. A conversation interrupted 3 times by a glance at a phone is not simply a slightly less polished version of a fully attentive conversation. It is, from the standpoint of memory formation, an almost entirely different experience because the fragments of divided attention rarely accumulate into anything durable enough to be remembered clearly at all. If you want your presence to register as unforgettable, protecting the wholeness of your attention even in small ordinary interactions is not a minor courtesy. It is the actual mechanism through which memorability becomes possible in the first place. There's a broader cultural observation worth making here because it explains why attention has become such an unusually powerful lever for memorability, specifically in this moment in history more than in almost any previous era. Earlier generations lived with far more built-in scarcity of stimulation, which meant sustained attention toward another person wasn't a remarkable achievement so much as the ordinary default of daily life. There were fewer competing claims on focus. Fewer devices engineered specifically to fracture it. Fewer algorithms studying exactly which patterns of interruption would keep a person's eyes returning again and again to a screen. What used to be an unremarkable baseline, simply paying attention to the person in front of you, has within the span of roughly 1 generation, become something closer to a rare skill, one that most people have to consciously relearn rather than simply inherit by default. This is precisely why the principles in this chapter carry so much more weight now than they might have decades ago. You are not just competing against other people for memorability. You are competing against an entire attention economy engineered by extraordinarily well-resourced companies to be more immediately compelling than almost anything a single human being can offer in ordinary conversation. Understanding the scale of that competition is not meant to discourage you. It's meant to clarify exactly how valuable and exactly how rare genuine sustained attention has become, and therefore exactly how powerful it is when you choose to offer it fully. Chapter 12. Depth over reach. There is enormous pressure, especially in the world we live in now, to measure your impact by reach. How many people know your name? How many people follow you? How many people you've technically been in contact with over the course of your life or career? This is a seductive metric because it's easy to quantify, easy to display, and easy to compare against other people. But reach on its own is a remarkably poor predictor of how deeply or how long you'll actually be remembered. It is entirely possible to be known in a shallow passing sense by millions of people and forgotten by nearly all of them within days. It is equally possible to be known deeply, unforgettably, by a small number of people whose memory of you will last the rest of their lives and shape decisions they make long after you're gone. Depth, not reach, is what actually determines whether you become unforgettable. And understanding this distinction will save you from chasing the wrong goal entirely. Consider the mechanics of how memory actually works when it comes to other people. A shallow interaction, no matter how many times it's repeated with different people, tends to create only a shallow imprint, easily displaced by the next shallow interaction that comes along. A deep interaction, one built on genuine presence, honesty, and emotional resonance, creates a far more durable imprint, one that survives the passage of time and the accumulation of countless other less significant interactions. This means that a single deep conversation with one person can outweigh in terms of actual lasting impact hundreds of shallow interactions with hundreds of different people. The math of memorability does not reward volume. It rewards depth. And most people chasing reach because it's more visible and more easily measured never realize they're optimizing for the wrong outcome entirely. This principle has significant implications for how you actually choose to spend your time and energy. Particularly in a culture that constantly pressures people to network wider, connect with more people, expand their circle without limit. There is nothing wrong with meeting many people over the course of a life. But if the goal is genuine memorability, genuine lasting impact, the far more effective strategy is to occasionally sacrifice breadth in favor of depth, choosing to invest more fully in fewer relationships rather than spreading a thin, forgettable version of your presence across as many people as possible. A person who is remembered vividly by 50 people because they showed up fully and honestly in each of those 50 relationships has built something far more durable and meaningful than a person who is vaguely forgettably known by 5,000. There's also a compounding effect specific to depth that reach simply cannot replicate. Deep relationships tend to generate their own reach organically over time because the people who know you deeply become, without any deliberate strategy on your part, the people most likely to speak about you to others, to recommend you, to introduce you to opportunities, to keep your name alive in rooms you're not even present in. This is sometimes called earned reach as opposed to manufactured reach. And it tends to be far more durable and far more valuable because it's built on genuine testimony rather than passive awareness. A small number of people who deeply genuinely remember you and speak of you with real conviction will often do more for your long-term impact and reputation than a much larger number of people who merely recognize your name without any real emotional connection attached to it. Choosing depth over reach requires a kind of patience that runs against the grain of a culture obsessed with rapid visible growth. It means being willing to invest real time and real vulnerability into a smaller number of relationships even when the immediate visible payoff is less impressive than the numbers a reach-focused strategy might produce. But over the span of a life, it is depth, not reach, that people carry with them. It is depth, not reach, that gets spoken about at gatherings, referenced in moments of decision, remembered in the quiet, private moments. When someone thinks back on the people who genuinely shaped who they became, reach fades quickly. Depth compounds for decades. It's worth acknowledging the practical tension this creates, because choosing depth over reach doesn't mean withdrawing from the wider world or refusing new connections altogether. It means being honest with yourself about which relationships you're actually willing to invest in deeply and giving yourself permission to let the rest remain lighter, more casual, without guilt over the fact that you can't give everyone the same depth of attention. Trying to offer deep, unforgettable presence to every single person you meet is not only impossible, it actually dilutes the depth available for the relationships that matter most. Part of choosing depth is accepting its natural limits, and trusting that a smaller number of genuinely deep connections will always outweigh a larger number of connections you tried and failed to make equally deep. It's also worth considering how depth and reach interact with time in fundamentally different ways, because this difference explains why so many people, especially early in their careers or their public lives, mistakenly prioritize reach over depth. Reach can be built relatively quickly. A single piece of content, a single introduction, a single well-timed opportunity can expose your name or your work to a large number of people almost instantly. Depth cannot be rushed in the same way. It requires repeated interaction, sustained honesty, and the accumulation of trust over time, none of which can be manufactured through a single clever moment. This makes reach far more appealing to anyone seeking quick validation because its results are immediate and visible. But it also means that reach built quickly tends to fade just as quickly, while depth built slowly tends to become more durable and more valuable. With every additional year it survives. If you find yourself drawn towards strategies that promise rapid visibility, it's worth asking honestly whether you're building something that will still matter to the people involved 5 or 10 years from now, or whether you're simply accumulating a larger number of forgettable impressions that will dissolve the moment something newer and more immediately stimulating comes along. There's a useful way to test in your own life whether you've been leaning too far toward reach at the expense of depth, and it involves a simple, somewhat uncomfortable exercise. Try listing the people who would notice genuinely and immediately if something difficult happened in your life. The people who would show up without needing to be asked twice simply because the relationship carries real weight. For most people, this list is considerably shorter than their total number of contacts, followers, or acquaintances. And that gap is worth sitting with honestly. It's not a sign of failure. It's simply an accurate picture of where your depth currently lives. and it can serve as a useful compass for where your future time and energy might be better spent. The goal is not to feel guilty about a large loose network of lighter connections. Reach has its own value, its own uses, its own place in a full life. The goal is simply to make sure that somewhere underneath that wider reach, you're also deliberately tending the smaller number of relationships capable of the kind of depth that actually produces lasting memorability. Because it is that shorter list, far more than the longer one, that will ultimately determine how deeply and how fondly you're remembered. There's one more distinction worth drawing here between the depth you offer others and the depth you allow yourself to receive from them. Because the two are not automatically the same skill. Many people are genuinely capable of offering deep attentive presence to others, listening well, showing up consistently, holding space for someone else's vulnerability while remaining far more guarded about allowing that same depth to flow in the opposite direction. This asymmetry is common, and it often comes from a quiet unexamined belief that being the one who receives care, attention and vulnerability is somehow more exposed, more risky than being the one who offers it. But relationships built entirely on one-directional depth eventually become unbalanced and over time less durable, because the person doing all the giving quietly accumulates a kind of fatigue, and the person doing all the receiving never gets the chance to fully know the person caring for them. True depth, the kind that produces the most lasting memorability on both sides of a relationship, requires a willingness to be known as much as a willingness to know, to receive presence as generously as you offer it. This is often the harder half of the skill, and it's worth naming directly, because a person who has mastered giving depth but never learned to receive it will often find themselves surrounded by people who feel cared for without ever quite achieving the same mutual reciprocal depth that makes a relationship genuinely unforgettable for everyone involved in it. Chapter 13. The Ripple Effect. Every interaction you have creates consequences that extend far beyond the two people directly involved in it. Even though almost nobody thinks about their impact in these terms, this chapter is about understanding and intentionally working with what might be called the ripple effect. The way your influence on one person inevitably reaches other people through the words they carry away, the behaviors they model, and the standard they now hold other interactions against, often without either of you ever realizing it's happening. Think about a moment when someone treated you with unusual kindness, generosity, or honesty in a way that genuinely shifted something in you. Now, consider how many times in the years since you've passed some version of that treatment on to someone else, consciously or not. Perhaps you learned a particular way of listening from someone who once listened to you that way. Perhaps you learned to be more direct, more encouraging, more patient because someone modeled that quality for you at a formative moment. This is the ripple effect in action. The way a single interaction with one person becomes through them an influence on dozens of people that person will go on to interact with, most of whom you will never meet and never know you affected. This has a profound implication for how you should think about the value of any single interaction, especially the ones that feel small or inconsequential in the moment. A single conversation with a stranger, a moment of patience with someone having a hard day, a piece of honest feedback delivered with genuine care. None of these might feel significant as they're happening. But if that interaction genuinely shifts something in the other person, even slightly, that shift doesn't stay contained to the two of you. It travels outward through every subsequent interaction that person has, carrying a small trace of your influence into rooms you'll never enter and conversations you'll never hear. This is in a very real sense how a person becomes unforgettable at a scale far beyond what direct memory alone could account for. You don't need to be remembered by everyone directly. You simply need to genuinely influence enough people deeply enough that your impact continues moving through the world long after any specific interaction with you has been consciously forgotten. Understanding the ripple effect also changes how you might think about difficult, tense, or even negative interactions, because the same principle applies in the other direction. A moment of cruelty, dismissiveness, or dishonesty doesn't stay contained either. It travels outward through the person it was directed at, sometimes shaping how they treat others for years afterward in ways neither of you would ever trace back to the original moment. This is not meant to induce anxiety about every interaction you have. It's meant to highlight just how much is actually at stake in the countless small, seemingly minor exchanges that fill an ordinary day. And why the disciplines covered throughout this video, presence, honesty, restraint, genuine care, matter far beyond the immediate moment they're practiced in. There's a specific practice worth adopting once you understand the ripple effect clearly. Beginning to think of every interaction, even brief ones, with people you'll likely never see again, as an opportunity to leave behind something worth passing forward rather than something to simply get through. This doesn't require grand gestures or lengthy conversations. It can be as simple as genuine eye contact and a real thank you to someone whose job makes them invisible to most people who interact with them. It can be a moment of unexpected patience with someone who's clearly having a difficult day. These small deposits made consistently across a life accumulate into an influence that extends far beyond what any single person could ever consciously track. And it is precisely this invisible compounding influence, more than any singular famous achievement, that constitutes the deepest and most lasting form of being remembered. There's a final layer to the ripple effect worth naming, one that connects it directly back to the idea of legacy explored in the chapter ahead. Because your influence travels through other people in ways you'll never fully see or measure. It means your impact on the world does not end when your direct interactions end. It continues moving outward through everyone you've touched and everyone they go on to touch indefinitely. This is in the most literal sense a kind of immortality available to absolutely anyone regardless of fame, wealth or public recognition. You do not need the world to remember your name for your influence to continue shaping it. You only need to have genuinely honestly shaped the people who crossed your path and trust that what you gave them will keep moving forward long after any specific memory of you has faded into the background. There's a specific kind of humility this understanding requires, one that runs counter to how our culture typically talks about influence and impact. We tend to want credit attached to our influence, to know that our name will be remembered as the source of whatever good we've contributed to another person's life. But the ripple effect by its very nature often works anonymously. The person you influenced years ago may no longer consciously remember that the quality they now embody. The patience, the honesty, the particular way they show up for others traces back to something they learned from you. This can feel at first like a loss, as though your influence doesn't fully count unless it's remembered and attributed correctly. But there's a different way to hold this that ultimately feels far more freeing. Your goal was never to be given credit for shaping someone. Your goal was to genuinely shape them for the better. If that shaping happened, and it continues moving forward through them into the lives of people you'll never meet, the ripple effect has done exactly what it was always meant to do, whether or not your name remains attached to it. This is in its own quiet way one of the purest forms of impact available to a person entirely detached from ego, entirely focused on whether the effect itself was genuinely good. There's a practical way to work with this understanding that connects directly back to the earlier chapters on presence and honest speech. If every interaction has the potential to ripple outward in ways you'll never see, then the question worth asking before difficult conversations, before moments of frustration, before the countless small exchanges that make up an ordinary day is not simply what outcome you want for yourself in that moment, but what you're actually modeling for the other person. And by extension for everyone that person will go on to influence. This doesn't mean performing an idealized version of patience or kindness that isn't genuine. It means recognizing that your honest reaction, whatever it is, becomes a kind of template the other person may unconsciously carry forward. If you handle frustration with someone by escalating it, you are in a very real sense teaching them that escalation is how frustration gets handled, and that lesson may travel through them into every future conflict they encounter. If you handle that same frustration by staying grounded, honest, and respectful even while disagreeing, you are teaching something different, something that ripples outward in a considerably more constructive direction. None of us can control every ripple we send outward. But understanding that the ripple exists at all is often enough to shift how carefully we choose to handle even the small, seemingly inconsequential moments that make up most of an ordinary life. Chapter 14. Building a legacy in real time. Most people think of legacy as something that gets assessed only at the end of a life. A final accounting tallied up after someone is gone. Determined by others looking back and deciding what that person's presence in the world amounted to. This framing, while common, creates a strange and unhelpful psychological distance. Treating legacy as a distant abstract concern rather than something being actively built moment by moment in the ordinary interactions of daily life. The truth is that legacy is not something you build at the end. It is something you are building right now in this exact stretch of your life through the accumulated weight of how you're treating the people around you today. This reframe matters because it changes the entire orientation of how you think about your daily choices. Rather than treating legacy as a far-off concern to be addressed, once you've achieved enough, accumulated enough, become important enough to warrant one, you can begin treating every single day as an active contribution to the legacy that's already forming, whether you're paying attention to it or not. The conversation you have this afternoon, the way you handle a moment of conflict this week, the small kindness or small dismissal you offer to someone this evening, all of it is legacy already being written, already shaping how you'll be remembered by the people currently in your life. Whether or not you ever achieve anything that would show up in an obituary, there's a specific danger in postponing legacy to some imagined future moment. And it's worth naming directly. It gives you permission to be careless in the present on the theory that you'll make up for it later. Once you're more established, more successful, more capable of the grand gesture you imagine will define your legacy. But grand singular gestures rarely define legacy nearly as much as people assume they will. Far more often, legacy is defined by the sum of thousands of small, unremarkable moments, most of which the person living them never consciously registers as significant. This means that waiting for the right moment to start building your legacy is in practice a way of quietly wasting the moments that are actually building it right now, whether you intend them to or not. Building a legacy in real time requires a specific kind of attention. One that treats the present moment as inherently significant rather than as a placeholder before the significant moments arrive. It means recognizing that the way you speak to your family tonight is not separate from your legacy, waiting to be overshadowed by some future achievement. It is your legacy actively forming right now. It means recognizing that the way you treat a colleague during an ordinary unremarkable workday is not a footnote to your career but an actual active chapter of how that colleague will remember you for the rest of their working life. Nothing about this requires waiting. Everything about this is already available in the very next interaction you have. There's also a liberating quality to this reframe that's worth sitting with. If legacy is built in real time through ordinary moments rather than singular grand achievements, then it becomes available to absolutely everyone regardless of status, wealth, fame or any external marker of success. You do not need a platform, a title or a public accomplishment to build a legacy that genuinely outlasts you. You need only the willingness to bring the full weight of your presence, honesty, and care into the ordinary interactions that already make up your life. This is in many ways the most democratic and accessible truth in this entire video. The tools for becoming unforgettable were never reserved for the exceptional few. They were always available in every conversation to anyone willing to actually use them. There's one final practical way to hold this idea, and it's worth carrying forward as something close to a daily discipline. At the end of each day, rather than only reviewing what you accomplished or produced, take a moment to consider who you actually were with the people you encountered. Were you present or distracted? Were you honest or deluded? Did you leave people with a feeling of being genuinely seen or with the quiet, forgettable residue of an interaction that could have happened with anyone? This kind of daily reflection doesn't need to take more than a minute, but practiced consistently, it keeps legacy from remaining an abstract idea you agree with in theory and turns it into something you're actively deliberately shaping, one ordinary day at a time. There's a final important clarification worth making about the relationship between legacy and mortality because this chapter's title deliberately invokes something people often avoid thinking about directly. Building a legacy in real time does not require morbid preoccupation with the fact that your time is limited. Though there is real value in occasionally letting that awareness sharpen your sense of what actually matters. What it requires more practically is simply refusing to treat the present moment as a rehearsal for some more important future moment that hasn't arrived yet. So much of modern life is spent in this rehearsal mindset. Treating today as preparation, treating this relationship as a stepping stone, treating this version of yourself as not quite ready for the real performance that will supposedly begin later. But there is no later performance. This is the performance already underway, already being watched, already being remembered by the people currently in your life. The moment you stop treating your current life as a warm-up and start treating it as the actual meaningful substance of your legacy is the moment you begin building something that will genuinely outlast you. Not through some dramatic future achievement, but through the accumulated weight of a present you are finally willing to take seriously. There's a common objection worth addressing directly because it tends to surface the moment someone genuinely absorbs this idea. What about the people whose circumstances genuinely limit what they can offer right now? Who are surviving a difficult season, managing illness, grief, financial strain, or simply exhaustion, and who feel they have little capacity left over for the kind of intentional presence this chapter describes. This is a fair and important concern, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissive one. Building a legacy in real time does not require constant high-effort performance of your best possible self in every single moment. It requires honesty about where you actually are. And that honesty, even when it includes struggle, limitation, or exhaustion, is itself a form of legacy, often a more powerful one than a polished performance would have been. A parent who tells their child honestly, "I'm having a hard time right now and I love you and I'm doing my best," is building a legacy of honesty and resilience that will likely mean more over the long run than a parent who hid every struggle behind a flawless facade. Building legacy in real time is not about achieving some unattainable standard of constant excellence. It's about staying honest and present within whatever capacity you actually have in whatever season of life you're actually in. Trusting that even limited honest presence outweighs an absent performed perfection you were never going to sustain anyway. Chapter 15. The Person They Never Forget. We've now covered 14 distinct principles, each one addressing a different dimension of what makes a person genuinely lastingly memorable. We've talked about releasing the exhausting pursuit of universal likability. We've talked about the cost of blending in and the quiet power of staying undiluted. We've explored presence as a choice rather than a trait and the weight that comes from speaking less but meaning more. We've looked at the emotional fingerprints you leave behind, the discipline required to stay consistent across years rather than moments, and the surprising strength found in genuine vulnerability. We've examined the art of saying no, the power of becoming a living story, the currency of genuine attention, the compounding value of depth over reach, the invisible ripple effect that carries your influence far beyond what you'll ever directly witness. And the understanding that legacy is being built right now, not someday. Before drawing these threads together, it's worth pausing on why these particular 15 principles, out of everything that could have been said about memorability, were the ones chosen for this video. They were not selected because they're easy or because they offer quick surface-level tricks for appearing more interesting at a party. They were selected because each one addresses a different layer of the same underlying pattern. The gap between the version of a person the world usually gets filtered, cautious, managed for approval, and the version of that person that actually exists underneath. Fuller, more specific, more capable of genuine connection than the filtered version ever allowed. Every principle in this video in one way or another is really about closing that gap. Releasing the need for universal approval closes it. Staying present instead of distracted closes it. Speaking with restraint and meaning closes it. Allowing real vulnerability closes it. Building consistency across years closes it. Each chapter examined from this angle isn't really a separate idea. It's the same idea examined from 15 different angles applied to 15 different dimensions of how a person shows up in the world. If there is one thread that ties all 14 of these principles together, it is this. Rarity is not a performance. It cannot be faked, manufactured or shortcut. Because the moment any of these qualities becomes a strategy rather than a genuine expression of who you actually are, it stops working. People can feel the difference, even if they can't always articulate it, between someone who is genuinely present and someone performing presence, between someone genuinely vulnerable and someone using vulnerability as a calculated technique, between someone whose consistency reflects real character and someone whose consistency is simply a well-maintained image. The entire framework in this video only works when it's built on an underlying commitment to actually becoming on the inside. The kind of person these principles describe rather than simply learning to display the outward signs of that person while remaining unchanged underneath. It's worth being specific about what this actually looks like in practice because abstractions about becoming your true self can feel vague to the point of being unusable. In concrete terms, it looks like this. The next time you feel the pull to soften an honest opinion into a safer one, you let the honest version stand instead. The next time your attention starts to drift in a conversation, you notice it and gently bring it back to the person in front of you. The next time you're tempted to fill an important pause with unnecessary words, you let the silence hold instead. The next time you feel the urge to present only your polished, competent side, you consider whether a moment of real honesty might actually serve the relationship better than the performance would. None of these moments on their own will transform how you're remembered. But each one is a small vote for the kind of person these 15 chapters have described. And votes cast consistently enough over months and years eventually become a verdict. One written not by you alone but by everyone who has experienced the accumulated weight of those choices. This is in the end both the hardest and the most freeing truth about becoming unforgettable. It's hard because there is no shortcut, no script, no set of phrases you can memorize and deploy that will substitute for the real, sometimes uncomfortable work of actually living with more honesty, more presence, more consistency, and more care than most people are willing to practice. It's freeing because it means the path is available to literally anyone regardless of natural charisma, social status, appearance, or any of the other qualities our culture mistakenly treats as prerequisites for being memorable. You do not need to be the most talented person in the room to become the person that room never forgets. You need only be willing to show up again and again as the truest, most undiluted version of yourself and to extend that same quality of honest attention to the people around you. Think back one more time to the person you described at the very beginning of this video. The one you couldn't stop thinking about after meeting them. Chances are, as strange as it might sound, they weren't doing anything you're incapable of doing yourself. They weren't hiding some secret talent unavailable to the rest of us. They had simply somewhere along the way given themselves permission to stop diluting who they were, to stay present instead of distracted, to speak with weight instead of noise, to let themselves be seen rather than perform. And to treat the people in front of them as though the moment actually mattered. That permission is available to you, too. Starting with your very next conversation. It's worth being honest about something before we close. None of what's been described in this video will feel comfortable at first. Choosing honesty over easy agreement, presence over distraction, depth over easy reach will often feel like a risk because in a very real sense it is one. You are risking the shallow guaranteed comfort of blending in for the uncertain harder won reward of actually being known. But this is a risk worth taking because the alternative, the safe, diluted, forgettable path, most people default to without ever choosing it consciously, guarantees an outcome far worse than any discomfort these principles might ask of you. It guarantees being forgotten. And between the discomfort of being fully yourself and the quiet tragedy of being forgotten, there has never really been a difficult choice at all. There's a final image worth leaving you with. One that ties every chapter of this video into a single simple picture. Imagine many years from now, someone describing you to a person who never had the chance to meet you. Imagine the words they'd reach for. Would they describe someone pleasant but forgettable? A name attached to no particular story, no particular feeling, no particular impact. Or would they describe someone specific? Someone whose presence they can still feel even now. Someone whose honesty, whose attention, whose particular way of showing up in the world left a mark that time hasn't managed to erase. That description, whichever version it turns out to be, is not being written by fate or luck. It is being written one ordinary interaction at a time by the choices available to you, starting today in the very next conversation with the very next person who crosses your path. Every principle in this video points toward the same simple demanding truth. Rarity is a decision renewed constantly to stop hiding behind the safe, diluted, forgettable version of yourself and to let the real one be seen instead. It will not always be comfortable. It will occasionally cost you the easy approval of people who preferred the smaller, safer version of you. But it will build something that easy approval never could. A presence people actually remember, a character people actually trust, and a legacy that continues moving through the world long after any single conversation with you has ended. There is no perfect moment to begin any of this. There is no version of your life where the conditions will finally be ideal enough to start showing up as your fullest, most undiluted self. The conditions in truth are exactly as good right now as they will ever be. Because the only thing any of these 15 principles have ever required is your willingness, not your circumstances. You do not need a bigger platform, a more impressive resume, or a more forgiving audience to start practicing presence, honesty, restraint, and genuine care. You need only the next conversation, whenever it happens to arrive, and the choice available to you in that exact moment to show up as someone real rather than someone safe. Becoming rare was never about becoming someone else. It was always about becoming fully, unmistakably, undilutedly yourself, and trusting that the version of you that's been waiting underneath all the careful editing is exactly the version worth being remembered for. The next room you walk into is waiting for that version of you to show up. Go be the person they never forget.